Hello, I am Dawn Westmoreland, hailing from Asheville, North Carolina, the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains, hailing from WPVM LP FM 103.7, the voice of Asheville. Every week at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Thursdays, I talk about the workplace. We could be talking about leadership, diversity, inclusion, just about anything. And today I am so excited to have back Samuel Levine, who's a professor at the Law Center. I'll have him tell you a little bit more about what he does.
Well, thank you so much, John. And it's so nice to see you again, and such an honor and a pleasure for me to join you again and your viewers and listeners. My background is, as you mentioned, in law, and my background is also in Jewish studies, in Jewish law. And part of what we're going to discuss today draws upon my studies in both of these areas. I attended Fordham Law School in New York City and Columbia Law School, also in New York City. At the same time, I was studying for my rabbinic degree at Yeshiva University. So as I studied the law, I recognized areas of comparison and contrast between Jewish law and the American legal system, both as a law student and then as part of my academic pursuits and my scholarship as a professor of law. My primary areas in the American legal system are actually criminal law and legal ethics. And in addition to being professor of law at Touro Law School in New York, I'm director of the Jewish Law Institute at Touro, which focuses on comparisons and contrasts within the two legal systems.
Thank you. I couldn't have said all of that. You have such a wealth of information.
Thank you.
And to the listeners, I have interviewed Samuel before. His interviews are very popular. And we're going to talk about bullying in the workplace, or we could call it incivility, or we could call it harassment. It still exists, even though there's so many programs out there for people to get along. Samuel, why is it important to get along in the workplace?
Well, Don, I think it's important to get along everywhere. And not just because it's the right thing to do, I wish that would be enough for all of us, but the reality that we have to recognize is that we sometimes have to explain to people, whether it's an employer, whether it's fellow employees, whether it's peers in the schoolyard, that it's within their own best interests, it's to their advantage to get along with others. A boss, a business owner will be able to do much better, to be able to profit. The bottom line improves if there's better relationships between the employer and the employee, among employees, and a toxic workplace, a workplace where bullying is accepted, where isolation is the norm among different employees, backbiting, office politics, that's only going to be detrimental to the workplace. So I appreciate your efforts in combating bullying, in combating harassment, and promoting these forms of civility.
Samuel, you've written a book. And let's talk about the book and how it ties into people accepting, it talks about inclusion, belonging, and why that one person may be, one of the greatest assets.
So the title of my book, as we discussed previously briefly, is Was Yosef on the Spectrum? Exploring the biblical character Joseph, son of Jacob, and looking at his experiences through a contemporary understanding of autism, through the autism prism, with the expectation that we can better understand the past if we look through history, if we look through, in my case, looking through the way biblical interpreters, Jewish biblical commentators, midrashim, other interpretations added to, expanded upon, explained the somewhat at times terse biblical text and understood, filled in what's going on in the story. And we can better appreciate our present through looking to the past and drawing those lessons that we often do from history. And in this case, what we find, and my thesis for the book, is we can not only understand the story itself better. And those of you who are familiar, without getting into all the details, I've discussed this previously on your show, but the idea that this dreamer, that this child who has these dreams, these visions, these ambitions, who's unpopular among his peers, whose brothers bully him, isolate him, whose father tries to navigate that relationship, who's ultimately sold into slavery, eventually is promoted, gets the job that he is fit for, and succeeds with the appropriate supports and structures within that employment setting. That's a very broad arc of the story, and understanding that story through the prism of autism. And we can be talking about autism, we can be talking about other differences, and we can be talking more broadly about neurodiversity, about people having different ways of thinking, about people having different approaches and perspectives, and appreciating that this diversity in thought can actually add to the workplace, can contribute to the success of the workplace, rather than allowing it to distract and deter and to deteriorate into the form of bullying and isolation that you've worked so hard uh, to prevent in the workplace yourself, Dawn. So it starts with this story. Rather than the workplace, it actually begins both, I think, in the story of Joseph and for ourselves as well. It begins from the childhood setting. Because although the workplace is by definition generally a place for adults, adults were once children, and adults draw upon their own experiences, their own actions, their own traumas that they experience as children. And if we think about the playground, I like to give that example because within the classroom setting, we haven't perfected that either. We have a long ways to go when it comes to special education, when it comes to including all types of learners in the classroom. But within the classroom setting, there is at least the possibility of the teacher, of the person who's in charge, being at the front of the room, maybe having some aides in the classroom, and keeping that structure and setting, and at least limiting the forms of bullying or isolation that can take place. But when it comes to the schoolyard, and I use that term broadly, to represent the unstructured time, the place where there are unwritten rules, where people are supposed to navigate, where children are supposed to navigate their setting and understand what's okay and what's not okay without anyone telling them necessarily how it's supposed to go. And that's where, when it comes to autism in particular, we find the vulnerability. And unfortunately, tragically, that's where we find the bullying often takes place. That's where the interactions are so fraught with peril. And in the story of Joseph, there's the episode near the beginning of the story where Jacob, Joseph's father, who loves him, wants to demonstrate his skill, wants to demonstrate that apparently he's really good at being a shepherd. And in those days, that was, at least for their family, that was their main vocation. That was what they did. So Jacob figures, well, if I send Joseph to his brothers, they're out shepherding in the fields. If I send him, he has the opportunity to demonstrate to them the skills he has. But what tragically happens is, because they're out of the careful watch of their father, because they're in that unstructured setting, the unprotected setting, that's where Joseph isn't able to navigate the social aspects of the interaction. That's where Joseph says the wrong thing, does the wrong thing, doesn't anticipate, doesn't realize that his brothers are actually setting him up for failure, for bullying, and worse, ultimately sell him to slavery in Egypt. So that's our first setting where we experience, where we see the dynamic of an individual who, on the one hand, is skilled at what he's told to do, who follows the instructions so carefully. His father has told him, go see how they're doing in the fields. And as the story describes, Joseph actually goes out and perseveres and pursues his brothers from place to place to make sure he finds them, to make sure he follows the instructions, and without overgeneralizing, without stereotyping, individuals on the autism spectrum are dedicated, are often, I would say usually, faithful to what they're supposed to be doing. They want that structure. They embrace the responsibility and the opportunity that comes with those instructions. And Joseph follows those instructions to his own peril. He doesn't realize, he doesn't recognize he's actually endangering himself and walking right into the trap that his brother set for him. Fast forward, Joseph in Egypt ends up being he's sold into slavery into Egypt. He ends up being very successful because there are those among the Egyptian higher ups who recognize his skills, who employ him. Here too, in the employment setting, and this is what we often find in unhealthy if not toxic work environments, we have a situation where, in a sense, we're back in the schoolyard. There's the office politics. There's all the competition. There's the backbiting. There's the undermining of each other. And there's the opportunity for supervisors, for people in positions of power, to take unfair advantage in every possible way of those who are working for them. And what we find initially with Joseph is, in some ways, a preview. Thousands of years before the Me Too era of our days, we have a situation where his superior is the wife of Potiphar, and she, his ultimate boss, she's his superior, and she propositions him. Now he refuses. He's faithful. Once again, that dedication he has to his sense of morality, to his sense of truth, to both his father and his God. This notion of morality that, once again, we find without stereotyping, we often find to be common and pronounced among individuals on the autism spectrum. He refuses her propositions, but at the same time, he's dedicated to his job. He's dedicated to his master, to her husband, who is his boss. So he goes in day after day to the job. She continues relentlessly to proposition him, and Joseph continues to refuse her propositions. He stands up to her, and ultimately, she sets up a scenario. She manufactures a scenario where they will be alone in the house. And as the commentators, the text itself in the Torah, in the Bible, and the commentators expound upon the scenario where there's no one else around. And Joseph doesn't quite realize, or he does realize, and he nevertheless is so dedicated to his job, to the structure that he's embraced, and to doing what he's supposed to do, that he goes in again, and this time she has him trapped. And ultimately, he once again refuses her advances, and of all things, she falsely accuses him. Now, he's in this vulnerable position where he's not able to respond, and if he tries to respond, it'll be fruitless to her false accusations, and as a result, he's the victim. Blame the victim. And once again, this is a very common phenomenon that we see all too often, tragically, where it's the individual, whether it's an individual on the autism spectrum or another person in the workplace, and you've worked so long and in such an effective way to try to combat this, Dawn, where the individual who's being bullied in the workplace or in the schoolyard is the one who's blamed. It's the one who's victimized, who ends up being blamed for the altercation. And once again, if it's the supervisor's word versus the employee, unfortunately, the boss will often side with the supervisor, let alone in this case, where, of course, it's the boss's wife. And interestingly, it seems from the text itself, there's a hint to the possibility that he doesn't quite believe her. He kind of knows her well, and he knows that she's capable of manufacturing this whole scenario and manufacturing the story. But on the other hand, he doesn't seem to be in a position to side with this Hebrew, with this slave, with this underling in favor of his wife, in favor of the person in power. So we see this dynamic as well throughout the story. And this is a dynamic that thousands of years later we encounter all too often in the workplace. Well, as a result of being in prison, Joseph finds himself with two other prisoners of note, two prisoners who had been Pharaoh's servants, butler and baker, simply enough. They have dreams, and Joseph, and we mentioned in passing he had these dreams when he was young, Joseph's really good at dreams. He has dreams that ultimately come true, and he also is able to interpret dreams really well. So he interprets the dreams for both the butler and the baker, telling the butler that he is going to be returned to the good graces of the king. He's going to, after whatever he has done, to be in prison, which was relatively minor from all we can tell, he's going to return to his position of authority as the king's butler, and the baker of all things is going to be executed. What he's done to the king, which was likely minor as well, is nevertheless considered to be worthy of capital punishment. The butler is so impressed with Joseph's interpretation, as is the baker, as he's upset, of course, but they realize that Joseph knows what he's talking about. He's really good at this. This is a particular skill that he has, a particular interest he has. And again, not uncommon for autistic individuals to have a particular skill. It's an interest, an area where they're particularly able to demonstrate an, an area of potential, an area where they'd be an asset to an employer. And for Joseph, this seems to be this area of dreams. So they recognize just how impressive he is and how skilled he is at interpreting dreams. So when the butler returns to the king, when he's reinstated in the royal setting, of all things, Pharaoh has dreams. And these are the famous dreams that Pharaoh is unsure what they mean. He can't find anyone to interpret them. He calls out to all of his sorcerers, it seems, to all of the wise individuals throughout the kingdom. No one can figure it out. So the butler says, well, I've got someone for you. And it's interesting. The butler recommends Joseph, but he uses pejorative terms to recommend Joseph. He uses these terms that in contemporary terms would suggest some sort of caution, some sort of thinly veiled indication to Pharaoh that on the one hand, this potential job candidate can do the job, but on the other hand, watch out for them. Watch out for things they're going to say or things they're going to do. And understanding that dynamic and that phenomenon within the contemporary employment setting, once again, in particular, when it comes to people, potential employees, candidates who are different, whether we're talking about autism or thinking differently or acting differently or being culturally different, and the resistance that employers sometimes have to hiring someone who doesn't think like them, doesn't look like them, doesn't act like them, even when that individual can do the job. And that's what's happening here. The butler knows Joseph can do the job. Joseph has demonstrated his skill, his unique ability to interpret dreams. He is the perfect candidate for this job. The job description is interpret Pharaoh's dreams. No one else can do it. But the butler is still unsure because there's that cultural, that bias, that discrimination, as we call it in contemporary terms, that's getting in the way. Maybe Pharaoh won't be happy, not with the skills that this candidate can bring to the table, but the way Joseph communicates those skills, the way Joseph explains things, because when he was in prison with the butler and the baker, although he did interpret the dreams correctly, he did so in a way that suggests social challenges, that suggests not being quite aware of the way he is communicating his ideas to others, not being quite aware of the way they're acting or reacting to him on a social level. Once again, some of these challenges Joseph's had with his brothers, with the wife of Potiphar, with the butler and the baker. Even when he is skilled, even when he's demonstrating his abilities, he does have those social challenges. He's so truthful, he's so honest that somehow sometimes gets in the way. Instead of diplomacy, Joseph all too often is very blunt, very straightforward in his communication. And that's not what we're used to when it comes to the employment setting, and specifically when it comes to the interview process. And here is one last lesson I think we might draw, and one more parallel between the story of Joseph and our contemporary employment setting. Joseph appears before Pharaoh. He's willing to take the chance on his candidate, and the interview, as it were, doesn't go well. And what I mean by that is Pharaoh opens the interview with small talk, as we might expect, and Joseph doesn't want to engage in small talk. Joseph's response to Pharaoh, and it would take more time than we have for our interview, but in the biblical text, in further explanation, I draw this out in my book as well, there's this clear disconnect between Pharaoh's attempts at conducting the interview the way we're used to and in Joseph's responses. And the disconnect is, and of all things, the fault I think is with our interview process, not with the candidate. Our interview process is designed to include this type of small talk, to include kind of a gamesmanship, as we sometimes call it, to
Mhm.
include playing these games, not really getting to the point, not really at all, getting to, are you qualified for this job? Instead, it's a question of, let me ask a tricky question and see how the candidate responds. If I make them uncomfortable, what are they going to say to me? How can they spin their capabilities, their qualifications? How can they promote themselves? Well, that's in the resume, and that should be clear to the employer before they conduct the interview. And of all things, if they're trying to find out whether this individual is skilled, let them do the job. Maybe the interview should be, okay, here's a sample of what we'd expect from you on this job. Let's see how you do, rather than let's engage in this kind of social games, these kind of small talk. And that's what happens. Joseph doesn't want to engage in the small talk, and of all things, Pharaoh says that's okay. Without saying so much, Pharaoh directly launches into, okay, here's my dream, let's see what you can do. And Joseph responds and once again interprets the dreams in a way that no one else was capable of, that is clear to all as being the accurate and brilliant interpretation of the dream. And Pharaoh realizes, okay, you're hired, right? On the spot. You're the person who can do this job. At the same time, Pharaoh realizes that Joseph has these challenges, has these social limitations, and he provides him the structures, the supports he needs so that he can avoid the politics, so that he can avoid the barbs, the backbiting, the sharks he's going to have to deal with. He's going to be hired by the king. He's going to be in a very prominent position of power. There are going to be people trying to get him and get to him.
Mhm.
And Pharaoh recognizes that maybe he's not up for those social aspects of the job, but you know what? Maybe we can provide the supports and structures. Maybe we can provide the setting where Joseph will be able to focus on his areas of skill. After all, that's why we hire people. And I think the lesson here for employers is to broaden our perspective, to broaden the scope of what we're looking for when we hire individuals, and to realize that if we really want the best person for the job, notions of diversity that we're familiar with, notions of neurodiversity, can improve the workplace, can contribute in so many ways, will not only result in more capable employees, but also, and here's where the Joseph story and Joseph's example demonstrates for us the possibility of having individuals who can do the job, who want to do the job, and when it comes to autism, who are dedicated to the job, who are loyal to their employers, and who are not looking to play office politics, who are not looking to undermine other people, who are not going to be the ones gossiping or taking 3 hour lunches. Dedicated employees who, when they have the skills, should be embraced, hired, promoted, retained, and given the opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities for these jobs.
Wow, that's pretty amazing to me, because I have to tell you, Samuel, the first thing that comes up in my mind is, I was in the Air Force 20 years, and to be able to be in any of the branches of the military, you have to meet, the physical requirements, the mental requirements, and unfortunately, autistic people are never let in. And that's not for me to argue or anything like that, but one of the best experiences I've had when I got out of the Air Force is I wrote a book, a draft, and a fellow that was in a leadership program with me, who also identified as having Asperger's, he said, I would love to look at your book, your draft. And I gave it to him, and it was a pretty lengthy book, within 72 hours, he must have had 1,000 comments. And I have to say, while I didn't agree on all of them, he saw a lot of things that I could have never saw with the way that my brain is wired. And it was a great help. So I can see why, even being neurodiverse, or, I hate the word disabled, because it's not disabled. It's just, we're wired differently.
Thank you, Don. Well, first, thank you for your service, and your experiences in the military are quite telling in the sense that from what I've heard as an outsider, haven't done the dedicated service you had, um, but there's that side of the military of following orders and
Yeah.
not disobeying the higher ups. And on the one hand, we certainly recognize why that can be crucial within the military. But the downside, from what I've heard, again, as an insider, and I'm curious of your thoughts, is that when you don't have that diversity of thought, when you don't have that willingness and encouraging employees to question things, to think differently. And this goes back to the interview, where if someone says the wrong thing, or I should say, says the right thing, but they say it in the wrong way.
Yeah.
And this happened with Joseph. He said to Pharaoh, there's going to be a famine. And you can imagine the king of the Egyptian empire, the last thing he wants to hear, oh great, we're going to have years of famine. Now what? But instead of saying, I don't need you in my workplace, I don't need someone who's negative like you. We're all happy here. We're all positive. Let's keep with it. Instead, he embraced Joseph and said, well, you know what? Thank you for telling me that. And what are we going to do about it? And Joseph devises a plan. And to me, that's the side that we're missing. If we don't embrace and include people who think differently, we're all going to think the same way. And groupthink has that danger of missing sometimes the obvious, sometimes what's not so obvious. And your story speaks to that point. If you're going to write a book, if you're going to write some ideas, if you're going to brainstorm, and everyone thinks the same way, then you're going to be missing out. And interestingly, final point in terms of Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams, it may be not only that Joseph was good at this, that he was skilled at interpreting dreams. It may be that Joseph was the only one who was so dedicated to the truth, something that had gotten him in trouble in the past when he said the right thing, but in the wrong way.
Hmm.
Well, maybe this was a time when no one else was willing to speak up. Maybe the reason the sorcerers, the wise people in the kingdom, maybe the reason they couldn't get the dream isn't so much they didn't realize that there was going to be a famine, but maybe they didn't want to break the bad news to Pharaoh. Who wants to tell the boss things are looking bad? Who wants to go into an interview and say, I've been researching your business and here you've got this problem that and the truth is that's the employee. That's a candidate that we should be embracing. If someone is so dedicated to A, understanding your business, and B, has identified potential problems with your business, well, that's the person you want on your side. That's the person you want to look to for help and for advice. And I think that notion of neurodiversity, that idea that different ways of thinking can contribute, not always right, and we're not always going to accept anyone's ideas as necessarily being the only appropriate response. But if we all think the same way, we're going to be missing out on looking and incorporating ideas that think differently.
Samuel, we're down to the last minute. Any advice you'd like to give to employers about people who are maybe neurodiverse or, autistic?
Well, A is just to have an open mind. The most basic change, I think, is in the mindset. And this goes back again to the school setting and particularly to employers to recognize that you're missing out on a talent pool. And just to make the point, I think it's worth noting not every autistic employee is going to be a Joseph. Let's not set the bar too high. Let's not set unfair expectations. But the rest of us aren't either. We all try to do our job as best as we can. And we all hope to get the job where we can demonstrate whatever abilities we have. And from the flip side, employers should recognize that if they're looking for the best person to do this job, if they broaden that pool, they may be pleasantly surprised by some of the talent, some of the dedication, some of the loyalty that comes along with opening up that pool to autistic and other neurodivergent individuals.
Samuel, thank you so much. Time goes so by. It goes so fast. It just goes by so quickly. Thank you again for being on the show. And to our listeners, is there a way to reach out to you if anybody wants to reach out to you?
So please feel free to reach out to me directly at my email. You can find that on the Turo Law website. Turo is spelled Touro, Turo Law Center out in Long Island, New York, where I am. Um, you can also contact me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Facebook as well. You can find my books on Amazon and at the publisher's website. The book on Joseph is published by Urim, URIM Publications, and I'm more than happy to connect.
To listeners, thank you for listening in. Stay empowered. We'll see you next time.